Boing, boom check. Well, not actually, it's NOTCAST 397, I think. It's Tuesday, 16th of July, 2024. It's about 9:30 in the evening, and that means that 26 years ago, because yes, I am old, right now I was watching New Order play their first show in 5 years at the Manchester Apollo. In fact, probably around about now, I think they were performing Atmosphere, which was quite an experience. Still in my top 5 gigs of all time. Very possibly, I think, number 2, actually, or number 3, come to think of it, after all these years. And I think about that and the passing of time, it doesn't seem like over a quarter of a century ago, but then very little does. And one of the things that doesn't feel like a third of a century ago, although it absolutely is the topic of today's episode, where I talk about Kraftwerk's 7th studio record, released in 1991, although it really doesn't feel like it was released in 1991, because they've only released one studio album since then. That album is The Mix, which is a strange and unusual concept record. I really like it, but it is and follows the tendency of a great many bands to start re-recording old material. And I have lots of opinions about bands re-recording old material. I have lots of opinions about, well, absolutely everything, which is why I still haven't run out of things to talk about after 400 hours of talking to my mobile phone about pop music. But there we are. The Mix was, I think, my entry point into the band. And at the same point, it was the first stage where, in my opinion, we started to feel the rot, so to speak, kind of kicking in a little bit with the band. Now, so for research purposes, I have taken the 2 autobiographies by the members of Kraftwerk that have been published. The Sound of the Machine by Carl Bartos. This is highly recommended. And I Was a Robot by Wolfgang Flür. Less highly recommended because it's more of an emotional, thematic journey through the band, as opposed to this, which is more chronological. Both are really interesting reads, and I recommend them to you. The Mix, released in June, I think, possibly July 1991, is, as I said, my entry point into the band. And as I've said before, I have an opinion about re-recordings. There are very few times when a re-recording of a band's work is justifiable or understandable. I think if you're Taylor Swift, our Lord and Saviour, Queen Taylor, then you can probably understand why it would be the right thing to do in order to wrest control back from evil business people, the material which you have unfortunately contractually not got ownership of. If you're Def Leppard and you're doing it just to make a bit of money, then that's a little bit cheeky. If for contractual reasons you don't own the rights to your material, re-recording is understandable. If you're just doing it because you've got new songs and you want to punt something out to the workplace, marketplace, and put a new record out so you can tour and make money, less artistically viable. The Mix occupies that strange and unusual ground of the band revisiting, re-recording, remixing, rearranging and rethinking their classic works. Not die classic works at all, the classic works, although one can debate whether this is actually classic works or not. And it comes from, I think, perhaps a little bit of commercial confusion, really, with Electric Cafe being, quote, dead in the water, unquote, according to this book, having slow sales, small hits, no live shows, the band practically disintegrating in front of your eyes. The idea of restarting Kraftwerk perhaps as more of a legacy act. This is where Kraftwerk started to become a heritage act or a history act, a museum to their own once former brilliance, and became more of a business. And you could see a dynamic shift in the band's approach from being musicians that made music to being businessmen that happened to sell music. And that's been a change that we've seen in the group, which has been reinforced by their very taciturn and unverbose activities in terms of interviews ever since. So with the release of The Telephone Call in 1987, the last single from Electric Cafe, which was the video shoot for that, was Wolfgang Flür's last appearance with the band. Ralf and Florian asked Wolfgang if he wanted to organise an update and digification of Kling Klang, because as you will see on the inside of this, although that isn't strictly the case, what you will see is that the band have effectively been replaced by robot avatars. The studio has been replaced by a fully digital mixing console, and has been rearranged completely and utterly in every way. And so Ralf and Florian, ostensibly the leaders of the group, asked Wolfgang if he wanted to digitise Kling Klang, but Wolfgang wasn't interested. There was no tours, there was no hit single, the LP didn't sell well. Wolfgang wasn't interested in what he regarded as administration, rebuilding the studio, so he moved to one of his other kind of passions, which was designing furniture, architecture, those type of things. And he said, I just stopped going to Kling Klang and joined the furniture studio, which was how he departed the group. And sometimes when you leave some situation, it might be a friendship, it might be a business, it's not a sudden, that's it, I'm going everybody out kind of approach. It's more of a kind of a slow, gradual movement out of the circle until you no longer fit. And then people change their phone numbers or email addresses, or they retire, or they delete their Facebook accounts or something. And then you just kind of lose contact with the people, which is an unusual way of it happening, but it is very definitely how these things take place. So the old Kling Klang studio, represented there, all analog knobs, switches, dials, wires, was replaced by this: hard drives and technology and computers and bits and bytes, moving the music into the computer world itself. And in fact, I have to go and get a book from downstairs and show you some photographs from the inside of the Kling Klang studio as was in 1991. And I'm back in the room. So in 1987, according to this book, the Kraftwerk studio started being rebuilt on the 16th of January 1987. They bought a New England digital synclavier with a cooling tower, hard drives, and Carl said that although he was starting to feel the economic gap, so the band worked on an unequal basis, Ralf and Florian clearly being the main shareholders, Wolfgang and Carl being somewhat regarded as employees, I think it's fair to say, found themselves in the situation where there was a clear and obvious kind of dynamic gap financially, and it felt, I think, unfair and unequal to the members of the group. Not necessarily unfair and unequal to Ralf and Florian, but very definitely to Carl and Wolfgang. And Carl got a massive tax bill in 1989 that really kind of highlighted the financial inequality that there was between the members of the band, even though Carl, Ralf and Florian were the main songwriting trio. To me, it felt like they were made out of three equals in terms of creativity. It wasn't necessarily translating in a commercial aspect. Some bands, they think, well, because I spent all those years in a van, I deserve to be paid more than you who joined the group after we became relatively successful. And I think that is a little unfair. And as we've seen with bands like Queen, one of the biggest causes for any divisions in a group is where songwriting and money isn't split equally. So, for example, Roger Taylor writing I'm in Love with My Car, which was on the B-side of Queen's Bohemian Rhapsody, made him as much money as Freddie Mercury, who wrote Bohemian Rhapsody, because it was on the B-side. And what that meant was you had a financial inequality that didn't actually reflect the success of the song or the situation. So this is why some groups categorize everything as being written by all of the band members, and then there's a division of responsibility elsewhere that isn't necessarily reflected in songwriting. So for U2, for example, as I understand it, Bono and Edge do most of the songwriting. Larry does some of the stuff around, for example, touring, routing, and Adam kind of looks at things like merch, visuals, graphics, video, that type of stuff. And then between them, that's an equal division of the band's labours, which is then reflected in the songwriting credits. Other bands don't have that equality. And with Wolfgang having left the group, there was a necessity to fill that fourth space inside Kling Klang. And Carl recommended a man called Henning Schmitz, who was a graduate from Dusseldorf, who had done some mixing on part of Electric Cafe and apparently done some engineering for the group. Henning recommended Fritz Hilpert in late January 1987 as a sound engineer and synclavier operator. And whilst the studio was rebuilt by Carl, Henning, and Fritz, Ralf and Florian watched television and talked. And Ralf and Florian took August 87 off. And so Carl was in the position of kind of writing paychecks for people, even though he wasn't actually an equal member with the other people in the group. And I think that rankled a little bit, and it felt a little bit unfair, according to what's in the book. Elektra suggested a best of and a tour, and Kraftwerk suggested an update to that. And by July 1988, Fritz and Carl had transferred to new hard drives the complete library. So all the sounds that they'd extracted from all of the old equipment, so they could reproduce it at the drop of a hat, fed it into the system. So effectively it became software instead of hardware. And you had a position where if you pressed a button, if you press the little key, it plays a little melody, out comes the sounds, and the sounds are replications of what the band were previously working with, their huge Kling Klang studio that they had taken on tour. At this point, Carl started to prep for the non-existent tour, which was going to sit alongside the update or the best of, and prepared songs like Man Machine, Showroom Dummies, Tour de France, Sex Object, The Telephone Call, and Music Non-Stop. And at this point, probably the best thing to do is to show you what the inside of the Kling Klang studio looked like. This is from a book called Kraftwerk Roboter, which is photographs of Kraftwerk's robots, which was published in the late 2010s, possibly the early 2020s, that reflected what the band's studio then looked like. There's Ralf Bot, and we've had Florian Bot, and there's possibly the one which is perhaps most interesting, which is a look at Ralf and Fritz and Florian Bot there operating as a trio after the band had become a trio. And so that was the mix, 1991. And the other photos are ones which you've seen. So everything was digitized. Everything was in the computer, the home computer, the computer world that would change the world. And Florian was more interested in voice technology, and so designed a thing called the RoboVox system, which was kind of like a highly synthesized version of effectively a speak and spell machine. You can hear it all over the Mix album. Carl was still writing material, and as Carl said, the longer we worked on the mix, the more I felt a bit useless. I wanted to play new stuff, and I had to do this boring project. And Fritz, as a fourth member of the group now, brought an objectivity and an outsider's view to the band, having been the first person to join the group in 16 years. And Carl was writing material as he was, often he used to kind of jam that material in a trio format with Ralf and Florian, but the group's writing mechanism and their home studios had atomised that a little bit. So we had a situation where in late 1989, Carl wrote a song called TV, released here under the name Electric Music in 1993, recorded it at home, and Fritz mixed it and played a demo to the group. And there was like a look on their faces, Ralf and Florian. And Florian felt it was a betrayal of the group to work separately outside of the Ralf and Florian unit. So Fritz was initially kind of like super excited and was like, yeah, brilliant, we've got this fantastic track that Carl's written, we can turn it into a Kraftwerk song. And if you listen to TV by Electric Music, it is one of the great lost Kraftwerk songs. If you hadn't known this guy had been in Kraftwerk, you'd be like, boy, he's really, really influenced by Kraftwerk. But of course, as REM have said about some of their outtake material, is it sounds too much like REM. I'm ripping myself off. Wayne Hussey did the same thing with Marianne and Wasteland by The Mission. When you're ripping yourself off, it's not really, it's not the greatest song in the world. It's a tribute. But with TV, this is a song that could have been on the Kraftwerk album that never came out, that could have been made in the late 80s or early 90s. But I think they had a crisis of confidence about their material. And in January 1989, the studio was complete. So the band had then spent 2 years effectively completely updating absolutely everything, but they didn't have any songs. Or if they did have any songs, there's certainly no public signs of those songs existing. I think that Ralph's creativity may have been switched off following the bike accident in 1982, because since 1982, they've only released one album of new, completely new studio material that hasn't been on any other records, which for the past 42 years is a pretty thin harvest. And instead went to becoming janitors of their own body of work. November 1989 saw Carl get a massive tax bill, as I've said, on the grounds of his earnings, and had difficulty paying it. And you kind of think, if you're in the greatest German group of all time that's had a #1 hit single, and you can't pay your tax bill, something's seriously wrong with the band's financial position. Personally, I would have made, if I was in the group, I would have made Carl an equal partner at that point. Carl wouldn't have left the group, and Kraftwerk would have continued on a more creative bent. But that's not what happened. Ralf and Florian had that view that they'd been in the group a long time, that they'd earned that position as being superior financially to other people, I think. And then Ralf and Florian became curators of a legacy, as opposed to musicians. There was a tour that was announced and took place, I think, in February 1990. There was a call to Wolfgang to go, would you like to play on the tour? And the answer was no. So Fritz was promoted to being the band's 4th member on stage, playing drums and keyboards, bass, rhythms, those type of things. And can't criticise him at all. Did a great job of it. Has a fantastic ear, an integral member of the group, even if the release element of the band kind of dried up. So the band played, I think, 5 shows in Italy. They played Bologna, Padua, Florence and Genoa. Effectively the only thing, the closest we ever got to an electric cafe tour. And it was effectively a repetition of the 1981 tour with a new drummer and 2 new songs. One is Tour de France, getting its live debuts, and the other one is Music Non-Stop. So the songs which Carl had prepared for the tour, Man Machine, Showroom Dummies, Telephone Call, Sex Object, were not played. And we had primitive arrangements of the material which was going to turn into the mix. So if you listen to those 1990 shows, absolutely fascinating to hear. The sounds are there, but the structure isn't there. The arrangements of the songs aren't yet complete. The intros aren't locked down. You know, those things just haven't happened yet. The band are still working through the starts and ends of the songs and where the bits are going to fit. So you think about a song on an album, for example, it's normally got 4 or 5 component parts: intro, verse, chorus, middle 8, break, etc. As Morrissey said, maybe a solo, maybe a vocal repetition or variation as we come towards the end and a conclusion. So 6 parts. Each one of those parts can be placed in a certain order, although we don't necessarily understand it. From an instinctive point of view, as a listener, if you have a song and it starts straight with the chorus, you're kind of going, wow, that's bold. Not many songs start straight with the chorus, for example. Or if you have a song that starts straight with a vocal, for example, you kind of go, well, there's not too many of those. It's the end of the world as we know it, for example. Every song by the Ramones, those type of things. If the song starts with a conclusion, you've put the conclusion in the wrong place. You've got that layering and that structuring of a song where you start off with an intro, you build up you start with a section that isn't actually the main part of the song. You might start with an instrumental version of the chorus. You add layers into each repetition of the verse and the chorus, extra tinkles and textures as you go through. The tour in 1990, the band hadn't yet nailed down those arrangements of those songs. Well, the songs that they'd been playing live for many, many years, Autobahn, for example, was relatively static, and Trans-Europe Express was relatively static and unchanged. Some of the major rethinking, songs like Computer Love, for example, the live versions of Tour de France, Music Non-Stop, Radioactivity, the ones where the most amount of rewriting had taken place, hadn't been finalised. So it's absolutely fascinating to listen to those recordings, knowing that is effectively a 4-date electric cafe tour 3 years after the album came out, but also pointing to where the band is about to go next. Fritz became the new guy. The band were built on a completely different way in terms of their digital approach than they'd done previously. So they weren't playing live. They'd built sequences and loops, and they were looping elements that were being played live. So, for example, you'd have a section of 4 bars that then repeated 16 times or 8 times or 32 times, for example, or you'd have a series of textures. They were all locked into each other on a MIDI track, very similar to how Underworld did their live shows. And then there was elements which were clearly defined that weren't going to change. All that was rigged up next to, I think, some laser discs, which were playing video that were sequenced to the sounds. This changed over time so that, in fact, the fourth member on stage of the group now actually triggers the videos. And the videos are linked to sounds, so the sounds play. So the sound, let's say it's a boing, boom, chack, will then automatically link into a video file that then plays and loops for a period of time before it changes and gets swapped out. This was similar to what the band had then, but they had a more rigid approach to Laserdiscs where not everything completely, fully lined up. And after those 4 shows, which Carl didn't enjoy and Florian didn't enjoy either, the band then went into finalising and completing the recording of the Mix album. And the Mix album, although not credited on the record at all, because the music data mix, according to this, is Ralf Hutter, Florian Schneider and Fritz Hilpert. Carl's fingerprints are all over this record. You can hear his programming, his sounds, even though he may not have performed the recordings that are on here and left during the production stage of the mix before the recordings actually happened. As far as I'm concerned, the Mix is an album that has Carl all over it, and you can hear it all through the album with those bouncy, kind of very strict, wonderfully danceable rhythms. So if you want to think, well, what did Kraftwerk lose when Carl left? Well, the first thing is they lost their sense of playfulness. They lost the sense of joyous experimentation with rhythm, which you can really hear in the solo release Electric Music, Esperanto, which is recorded by Carl, which features the singles Crosstalk, Lifestyle, and of course TV. So if you want to go, well, if you listen to the post-Carl material that the band have released, it's more staid, the rhythms aren't as interesting, they aren't as varied, they're not as lively, they're more respectful, they're more sedate. Even a track like Aerodynamique, which has the most upbeat, fast tempo of any of the Kraftwerk material released in the past 30 years. You can guarantee that had Carl been playing on that, it would have had an even sprightlier, more playful rhythm to it than it actually does. Not a criticism. I'm all for sedate. I'm all for stately. I'm old. I'm built for comfort, not for speed these days. But I do miss that element of the band. And there were some suggestions around doing some summer 1990 tour bookings. So there was a tour that was planned, never came to pass, didn't happen. And instead, on the 23rd of July 1990, after a final conversation between Carl, Ralf and Florian, where Carl was pushing to be made, I think, a more equal member of the group in terms of a creative and commercial element, the band, or at least Ralf and Florian, according to what Carl wrote, appeared to act as if it was quite surprising that Carl would want equity with the other members of the group, and therefore he left, handed over his keys, walked out of Kling Klang and left the group, and Carl didn't appear with them again. This period is kind of covered somewhat in this book here, Kraftwerk Man and Machine, which talks about some of the reactions behind the band's change at this point. The 1990 tour, for example, as Maxine Schmidt said, the only time they really have a professional life is when they're on the road, and they hate that. To put them on the road is an emotional drama for everyone, something terrible, especially for Florian, who is usually impossible to find for a few days before a tour begins. Everyone has big depressive crises, and with the realisation that in the past 10 years, he'd only released Computer World and Electric Cafe and only toured the world once, Carl was in a position where he felt that I think he explained it to Ralf, as he said, it feels like I've got this enormous jumbo jet that never takes off, but I need to fly my own plane and go where I need to go. Although Carl also said by the end of the 80s, Kraftwerk was a paralysed giant. The inner structure didn't allow any new ideas. And I'm very pleased that I had the chance to be in Kraftwerk, and it's a big honour, and it would be a contradiction to be bitter and proud at the same time. I still admire them. So that's, one way of looking at it. Some people were less impressed with what was going to happen next. Carl said, normally if you do a best of record, you splice the old tapes together and you put it out and you sell millions of records. But if you do the same songs and take out all the real things that made them strong in the first place, then bingo. The mix is not a best of. It's not a compilation. It's an album of reinterpretations and Kraftwerk remixing their own material. And it's significant in that respect. It's a very good record, but there is an element of when suddenly you find something that's been dexterized, to use Beatles parlance, where someone's remixed the original material to make it bouncier and jumpier, or perhaps where you listen to an album and suddenly go, oh, it's been resung, or it's got a dance beat on it, and was dance mixes, and what's that? Well, Kraftwerk are not just a dance band, they're a band for the legs, but they're also a band for the head, and also a band for the heart, and that's where the mix really came in. So for me, it was my entry point into the group, and the first time I heard them, I'm leaping ahead a little bit, is a live show, actually. I was aware of them, I was cognizant of the band, but the first time I remember actively, genuinely hearing them was, I think, on Tomorrow's World in 1991, where the band played, although they didn't play, it was the Robots, they played the Robots, the first fruits from the Mix album, available here on CD, 7-inch and 12-inch. The CD has the single edit of the Robots, and it has two remixes called Robotronic and Robotnik. Robotronic and Robotnik are actually alternate recordings of the track, Kraftwerk remixes of a remix. This is backed with the Robots and a single edit of Robotronic. This has just Robotronic on it. So Robotnik is only on the CD single in the UK, which is pretty surprising. Not something I'm particularly a fan of, but there you are. But these three tracks are effectively three different alternate variations and recordings of the song. And from that, what you can clearly see is the band's songs go through a multitude of variations before they get released. So the first one is you write the song. In this case, the Robots, written in 1977. The second thing that you do is you then finalise the structure of the song, and then the third one is you look at the variations. So each one of these versions, or each one of these three recordings, can effectively be seen as a filtered version of the song. One of which is, well, we take it in that direction. Another one is we take it in this direction with more bass. And that one we go, well, we make it chunkier and we give it a different set of rhythms. And you can splice these three tracks together to create a 25-minute version of the Robots, which is effectively the same as an album-length version of the song, which I have done, and I think is on Mixcloud, but it might have been deleted. If it isn't, I'll post a link up to it. If you want to hear a 25-minute version of Kraftwerk's The Robots, that's the place to go. And as I'm sneaking ahead again a little bit, Robotronic and Robotnik got their first album releases on this 2022's Remixes, triple LP and CD, which is really the sound of the band running out of ideas and issuing their own remixes of their own remixes, if that makes sense. But this album, by the way, think of it as effectively bonus discs to the Mix album and to the Tour de France album, and you won't go far wrong there, because that contains the majority of the band's non-LP material that's been released since 1990. I'll pick up that later. But the Robots featured new melodies, new lyrics, and whilst Carl did all the programming on the album and was uncredited, as far as I'm concerned, if you listen to the mix, you don't think that Carl's not in the group. It sounds like he's still in the band. It still sounds like Kraftwerk to me. It didn't chart vastly well as a single, and the album was a little bit strange as well at the same point, but the band then pivoted to live material and live performances, but not before the album came out. And like all Kraftwerk albums around about this time, it was issued in two separate editions. There's the UK edition here. I have two copies of this album on CD, which is a little strange, but there you are. Which is there, and this features, I think that's Fritz there on the front. Florian Bot on the back and Ralf Bot on the front, and then pictures of the 4 members of the group, although Fritz has 2 heads here. And the head is tilted to make you not realise that there's actually only 3 robots in here and they're repeating one of them. So quite cheeky. But then, of course, obviously, we've got Fritz Bot here, and we're not quite sure which one that is. And then we've got the graphics of Florian and Ralf Bot, and then the robot graphics. But the band at this point have become digital avatars. You don't see photographs of them. And the last time I think you saw a photograph of them on the cover of anything was one of the singles from Computer World. In fact, I'm not even sure you did then. I think maybe it was Man Machine was the last time that you saw a member of the group actually represented by a physical photograph of an actual living human being. The band have become digital avatars of themselves, effectively kind of precursors to Daft Punk becoming the robots themselves. This is the German edition of Die Mix, the mix, which contains German language performances. Now, given that previously the performances are different instrumentally, on this version, as far as I can tell out, the instrumental backings are the same, but the only difference that we have on the German version is the vocals and the Robo-Vox themselves, and the accents on the Boing Boom Shack in Music Non-Stop. But it is absolutely essential, if you're a fan of Kraftwerk, to get both the German and the English language versions of them. Unlike Electric Cafe, there is no Spanish language version. But the lyrics are perhaps slightly different. And it sounds a little bit snobby, kind of like people that like Studio Ghibli and go, well, the most authentic version is to listen to it in its original Japanese. Which is like saying, well, you know, you don't understand Shakespeare until you've read it in its native Klingon. Yes, that's a Star Trek joke, bitches. Have fun with that. But as an album, this is effectively the band performing live in the studio about 2/3 of their live set, which they'd planned for the tour in 1991. Title tracks of the albums, largely sequenced in order of release. We've got The Robots opens up the album, which is much as it did the Man Machine. Computer Love, a vastly rejigged, faster version of the song there with extra melody parts and arpeggios in it. Then we've got Pocket Calculator and Dentaku. Dentaku being a re-recording of the Japanese translation of Pocket Calculator. So effectively Pocket Calculator then moves into a Japanese language version, which is effectively also a remix of a remix, much like Robotnik or Robotronic are remixes of remixes. Dentaku is a remix of Pocket Calculator in a different language that forces you into thinking it's a separate song and it's a bit longer. It isn't. Autobahn is now presented in a 9.5-minute version instead of 22 minutes. Radioactivity gets the biggest change. The song is completely rethought. It's amped up, the BPM is lifted out, there's extra melodies in there, there's extra textures, there's whole new sections and bridges that highlight the dangers of radioactivity, nuclear power and things like that. So, you know, a monotonic voice saying, you know, Chernobyl, Hiroshima, Sellafield, exactly, Harrisburg, to reflect the 4 major nuclear events. Hiroshima being I think the first or second nuclear detonation in conflict, Sellafield being the location of a nuclear leak, Chernobyl being the leak that was also inspired, by the way, the Sisters of Mercy track Dominion, Mother Russia, Rain Down, 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 and the Smiths' Panic, and a fantastic HBO miniseries that was on a couple of years ago. So Chernobyl has had a big cultural impact. If you're a Mannix fan, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about, a cultural Chernobyl. And then Harrisburg, which is the location of 3 Mile Island, which is where the 1977 nuclear meltdown occurred that then inspired the film The China Syndrome. The idea being that nuclear meltdown would burrow through to the Earth's core and then surface somewhere in the middle of China. Quite interesting. But Radioactivity is one of my very favourite Kraftwerk tracks in the version that's on here. Never has nuclear fallout and contamination been so danceable. And God knows I've tried to listen to many songs about that. Not even It's the End of the World as we know it, and I feel fine. Then we had a tour of the UK in July 1991. And the tour of the UK in July 1991 was the first live shows without Carl in the band. So we had a new reconfigured version of the band, as shown on this advert here, taken from the pages of the esteemed and much lost Select magazine, starting at the Barrowlands in Glasgow, one of the finest venues in the universe, then going to Manchester, Liverpool, the Hummingbird in Birmingham. I thought about going with my dad to that, which I didn't do. Sheffield City Hall, Edinburgh Apollo, and then 2 nights at the Brixton Academy in London, ending on the 20th of July 1991. This lineup was augmented by Fernando Abrantes, a Portuguese musician who bore more than a passing resemblance to Carl Bartos, so much so that I don't think I think that he was chosen for his resemblance to Carl, so they didn't have to recast the head. Although they did recast the robot head later on, and that's why you do get then some more photos were taken, including this one, which has replaced Fritz with the second Fritz with Fernando's head there. Cheeky sausages. Fernando played 10 shows or so with Kraftwerk. Played on stage. Actually, he didn't. He played 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 shows with the group, and then left the band. I think it was the band's decision for him to leave because Fernando was very active on stage and clearly looked like he was actually enjoying himself, which, as we know, in the world of a repressed Kraftwerk environment where emotion cannot be expressed because they are robots, the closest thing you will ever get to a display of human emotion might be a wry smile or occasionally a slight movement of the knee, whereas Fernando was clearly having an absolutely wonderful time playing in his favourite group. And instead, the tour came to an end. Fernando was left the group and was replaced by Henning Schmitz. Henning, of course, being asked in 1987 if he'd like to join the group. Henning recommended Fritz Hilpert, and all the stars aligned. And then Henning was back in the group after doing some mixing on Electric Cafe. So the band do promote from within, and that's kind of admirable. But they haven't really taken with that pretty much came the end of the band's creativity, it's fair to say. So Henning joined in September 1991 for the European tour. And before that happened, I can't believe I'm leaping ahead of this, another single was released, the last Kraftwerk single for 9 years, Radioactivity, this time backed with remixes by Francis Kovakian. Francis had remixed Tour de France, he had remixed The Telephone Call, and there were 2 sets of mixes. So there was mixes by William Orbit, who did a hardcore mix, which is on this American 12-inch, and a William Orbit standard remix. And then there was also the Francis Kovakian remix, and on here there were 7-inch mixes of the Francis Kovakian track and the William Orbit standard 12-inch and the Francis Kovakian 12-inch. So the first time the band really kind of like pulled out and allowed external people to fully remix them without them being all over it like a rash. These are good remixes. They're not amazing, but they're good, they're faithful, they follow the structure of the song. And the hardcore mix was for a long period of time only available on this 12-inch single. So of course I had to buy it. I had to import it from America and spend £10 to get one Kraftwerk remix, because that's the kind of sad record collector scum that I am. But to be honest, if I wasn't, you wouldn't be watching this and I wouldn't be talking to my phone about Kraftwerk. So I guess all's well that ends well, right? And by the time the band got on tour, this time with Henning, things were a lot more organised. So they I think they opened their shows in Stockholm, and the first Stockholm show was released unofficially on this live CD, Kraftwerk Non-Stop, which I think I picked this up for £5, actually, which contains an audience recording of the Stockholm show, and it doesn't feature Tour de France, but otherwise it has the whole show on it. There are lots and lots of Kraftwerk bootlegs out here, because what Kraftwerk fans knew is that Kraftwerk might not have sold many records, but people that like Kraftwerk, they loved Kraftwerk. It wasn't just like a casual thing, like, oh, I'll buy the album and I'll go and see them at Wembley Stadium. It's not like liking, I don't know, The Cult or Bryan Adams or someone. Kraftwerk fans loved the band, absolutely loved the band, their favourite band. It's the kind of thing where you think about what bands do you see in charity shops, and that's the difference between bands that are loved and bands that are liked. You will see a lot of, You won't see Motorhead CDs or Metallica CDs or Kraftwerk CDs in charity shops. You know, you see Blur CDs, you see Fatboy Slim albums, you see Kasabian albums, you see bands that were liked, never loved. Proportionally. Then I think the other rule is, well, if you like a band, right, how much a band is loved has a direct correlation to the number of tattoos of the band that exist. By that correlation, of course, U2, Iron Maiden and Metallica are possibly the biggest and most loved bands in the universe. The number of Kraftwerk tattoos I've seen is considerably smaller because Kraftwerk don't have fans that can get tattooed. They have robots wrapped in human bodies. But that is not the point. The point is Kraftwerk CDs don't show up in charity shops because Kraftwerk aren't liked, they are loved. Or at least they were at this point, and they become a legacy act with a reputation like the Velvet Underground or somebody like that. A band that I regard them as the electronic version of the Beatles, without which a huge amount of my record collection wouldn't exist. New Order wouldn't have synthesizers. Depeche Mode wouldn't have them. Daft Punk, LCD Sound System, Orbital. They all took a cue from Kraftwerk and a future which was promised to us but never quite transpired, and then took it somewhere else. The second bootleg CD I have from the Mix Tour is recorded in Dusseldorf on the 31st of October 1991. Now this is a little cheeky. It tells you it's Westwood 1 Radio Rarities for radio broadcast. It is no such thing. It is an audience recording of the band live in Dusseldorf, and it's truncated to fit on one CD, which means you don't get music non-stop, you don't get Pocket Calculator, so you have a 78-minute live show. Now the thing around the live performances in 1991 especially is that most of the set was fully locked down, absolutely rigid. The one part where it wasn't was the track Music Non-Stop, which is 6 minutes on vinyl, and on some live shows, especially I think Milan in 1991, runs to a staggering 17 minutes of groove-based sonic instrumentation, texture and experimentation. There is a YouTuber called Andrew Shaw that has replicated as much as humanly possible Kraftwerk's studio from 1991 and has produced studio re-recordings using Kraftwerk's 5.1 mixes from the minimum maximum CD DVD set to sample some of the sounds, and then recreated studio recordings of, for example, Music Non-Stop from 1991. I'm strongly going to recommend Andrew Shaw's channel. Really interesting to hear high fidelity studio recordings that are very, very authentic, much like the Depeche Mode fans that downloaded all of Alan Wilder's old zip drives and then recreated instrumental Depeche Mode mixes. He's done a very similar thing by buying very, very similar equipment and trying to replicate the sounds as exactly as possible. This show, 1991 Dusseldorf, I think the live shows around about this period are probably my favourite Kraftwerk shows. And I saw the band in 1992. That was my first real exposure to them. So I was studying in Leicester, and the band were going to play 3 shows in the UK. They were supporting U2 at the Manchester G-Mex, a gig I really wish I'd gone to, but couldn't on the grounds that I was a poor student. But instead they played a warm-up show at Leicester University on the 18th of June 1992, and that was where I first saw Kraftwerk for the first time. £8.50, they had about 350 to 400 people in a venue that could possibly take 800 or so. You could literally walk up and buy tickets on the door because most people were like, why the hell are Kraftwerk playing Leicester? And it wasn't, £75 to get a ticket. It was £8.50 from the student union. It was only advertised locally. There were little photocopied green flyers at my university. And I had not made the decision to go until that afternoon, which now I kind of go, crazy, of course you're going to go to that. But I was in the stage of having had my first significant partner who wasn't a complete raving lunatic. Yeah. By the way, my first girlfriend was a bin fire of idiocy who possibly regrets their behaviour, but not as much as I regret meeting them. And so my second partner was a lovely person who guided me through being on the cusp of being an adult to being a man, and I was very, very lucky to experience that. And I was on for a hot date that night. I couldn't even text her because nobody had mobile phones and she didn't have a landline. So I had to knock the door and go, darling, I'm really, really sorry. I have to see Kraftwerk with my friends. And if I could have been in two places at once, I absolutely would have been. But at the same point, I got to see Kraftwerk play a warm-up show to 350 people in a student union in Leicester in June 1992 for £8.50, and it blew my mind. I had never experienced anything like it. The closest thing I'd experienced to the Kraftwerk live show was Pet Shop Boys' performance tour the previous year, which effectively was a thematic musical based around Pet Shop Boys songs. Kraftwerk was something very, very different. The first song I saw them perform live, they didn't actually perform live because it was the robots. And so I saw these 4 robots on stage doing a synchronized dance to this weird German techno song about being robots. And I was like, well, this is quirky. And then all of a sudden, and bearing in mind, I'm like 6 foot away from the stage and I've not heard this track before. I hear these huge German Teutonic multi-channel sounds going 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, 7, 8. Now I know I've mispronounced that. I'm sorry, I am a British idiot who only really speaks Britlandic and doesn't really speak any other languages apart from possibly... No, I don't even speak that. Every bit of German I know, I've really only learnt from Kraftwerk albums. You imagine the first time I heard Numbers, it was in a multi-channel, ear-shatteringly loud venue surrounded by 400 people as the band were playing 6 feet in front of me. I was a convert from that instance. 75 minutes later, I was like, they are amazing and I need to see this band more often. And I didn't get to see them for another 5 years. But it was a conversion. It was like the bit in Blues Brothers where Jake Elwood kind of goes, hallelujah, I have seen the light, and flies up to the sky. And suddenly, I, for one, welcome our new German techno overlords. And it was a marvellous experience, really, is to see, you know, stage divers, crowd surfers, to Pocket Calculator, to stand there and watch songs like, you know, the Model, Tour de France, Radioactivity, Trans-Europe Express for the first time with the band playing 6 feet away from me and being totally wowed by this incredible experience. I still regard the Leicester show as possibly my favourite Kraftwerk show, not necessarily the best, but my favourite, and easily in my top 20 of all time. Maybe I should do a ranking of my favourite gigs, actually. But no, that was a stunning experience. To then come out from that, having said the last song was, you know, Dead Tarku, as everything collapsed and fell to bits, and I was just like, there was no sense that this wasn't an amazing band at the peak of its powers. It really was a stunning show. You know, kind of like I imagine if the first time you ever saw AC/DC, or the first time you saw Led Zeppelin, or you know, the first time you saw your next favourite band that perhaps you weren't sure about. And there's very few times I've seen an act and they've completely sucked me in from the first moment to the last. Twilight Sad, one, Kraftwerk another, who I knew not very much about when I saw them live, but suddenly I was like, oh boy, I found another band that I love. And that doesn't happen very often, but I always look forward to it. Actually, Mogwai at Stoke in 1998 with Andy. Sorry, Andy, I miss you, man. Because Andy died a couple of years ago, and he shouldn't have done, but he did. A kind of thing where you see a band for the first time, Suede actually as well at Leicester in 1992, and you kind of go, wow, my life has changed. I am not the same person going out as I am coming in. What happened after that? Well, there's been 3 different releases of the album The Mix after 1991. The first one was the catalogue. This is the 2004 unreleased version of the catalogue box set, featuring a remaster that was later not utilised but prepared by the band in 2004, 2003. So this is a Kraftwerk Kling Klang Studio digital master of The Mix, which is in the 2004 box set. It was later remastered and released in an expanded edition in 2009, which has become the definitive digital masters of the tracks, following Florian's departure from the group. In 2020, these remasters were issued on coloured vinyl. Here is the German language version of The Mix, which was issued on coloured vinyl in 2020. And if you're going to go for Kraftwerk vinyl, I strongly recommend that you go for the 2020 coloured vinyl remasters, as well as original editions. If you can, go for the German language of the remasters, because they are unique and different recordings. And this is the double LP version of the mix, which runs to 66 minutes. I have a minor criticism about the mix, is that I think it should have had the telephone call on, but it didn't, because Carl wasn't a member of the group and it wasn't a re-recording, and it should have had a re-recording of Tour de France on, but it didn't. But Kraftwerk were holding that one back for a later period. This 2020 digital master of the album features an expanded booklet featuring photography of the group. So there's again Ralf Bot front and back. Here is, and let's just quickly check. So that is again the 4-piece version of the band with Florian, Ralf, and Fritz Bot. No Fernando. There is again Fritz Bot there. Hello, I'm Fritz Bot. Then we have a photograph of the group. This time I think featuring, Fernando there as the 4th robot, which didn't really last. I think this might be his only appearance in the booklet. We have a still from the Robots video there, Florian shyly covering his face. Then we have Ralf Bot there, I believe, or maybe Fritz Bot, I don't know. Then again, Ralf and Florian, and then a photograph of the inside of the studio. There's Ralf on the telephone, so close, but yet so far away. And again, a colour photograph of the updated Kling Klang studio from the photo session that you saw earlier. If you're getting into Kraftwerk vinyl, I would recommend, if you can, picking up an original 1991 edition for the different artwork and different masterings, but also it's relatively easy to pick up the UK edition, and then also to pick up the German language coloured vinyl version, and then you get both recordings of the albums. As previously mentioned, in 2017, the band's catalogue was fully refurbished and available in a 3rd remixed, re-recorded fashion. This one here, the catalogue 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, which is an absolutely essential way to experience the band's catalogue in a refurbished fashion. That said, it is not always, these are boutique releases, these are expensive, exhaustive, comprehensive reinterpretations of the band's entire official catalogue of work, and they're all available on streaming, so give those a listen if you can. This version of the mix on here contains a bonus track, but one that wasn't actually released in its original form until the year 2000, so we'll address that when we get to the year 2000. And then finally in 2022 came the Kraftwerk triple vinyl and double CD Kraftwerk Remixes. As I've said before, these are effectively bonus discs for the Tour de France album and the mix. This features 5 remixes from the mix period. Now you'd be surprised what those 5 mixes are. So as well as the aforementioned Robotronic and Robotnik getting their first vinyl releases on disc 1, and as well as also Radioactivity, the William Orbit remix in an edited form, and the Francis Kavakian 12-inch mix, so you get 4 bonus tracks. You get a previously unreleased Kraftwerk remix from the mix era on the Remixes 12-inch and CD, and that version of is a track called Non-Stop. Non-Stop is absolutely fascinating. In 1993, the band were commissioned by MTV to re-record a version of Music Non-Stop as an ident for MTV, and they supplied 4 30-second excerpts with computer graphics of a voice going music non-stop, and a new and alternate musical backing that you can't get anywhere else. These were excerpts from an 8.5 minute re-recording and rewriting of Music Non-Stop. On this one, it is credited music to Hutter and Hilpert, and words by Hutter, Schneider and Schultz. So that is Fritz rewrote the music for Music Non-Stop alongside the melodies which Ralf had written, and put together a new musical backing. So it's a previously unreleased Kraftwerk track that was recorded around about 1990, 1991, possibly 92, by the band, and previously it had only been heard on the MTV idents. So if you might think, oh, I don't need Kraftwerk remixes, there's nothing on it I don't already own. Au contraire, mon frère, this has a previously unreleased Kraftwerk recording from the mix era, a re-recording of Non-Stop. And the last re-recording from this period, which has still not been commercially released but was published on the band's MySpace page, that takes you back, was a new studio recording from 1991 of The Band Machine, which wasn't used for the mix album. That has been salvaged from the archives of the now unpublished MySpace page and has been published on YouTube and elsewhere, but officially not released. Although one could argue that an update to a band's MySpace page, including a previously unreleased musical track, counts as being officially released just to streaming. So I'm going to post links to that so you can hear that as well. This period was a period of, I think, consolidation and curation of the band's resetting their legacy and making themselves out to be electronic pioneers from a future that never quite happened, one that we didn't quite get to experience, the future that was promised in Metropolis, or at least parts of Metropolis, but never came to pass. Kraftwerk had the sound of a future that never happened, but one that came tantalisingly close to existing. And the mix was a way for the band to really present that as a possibility in a sea of 1,000 possibilities. A thing that could have happened but didn't. But on the other hand, we got so close to experiencing that it felt like we almost could see through the door. We just never quite walked through. By the end of this period, 1993, the band had released this greatest hits album that was reworked, reinterpreted, re-recorded versions of old tracks, reimagined for the modern day on new digital equipment. They'd lost 2 members and added 2 members. Carl Bartos, whose fingerprints are all over the mix, and who I regard the mix as an album that Carl Bartos performs on, even though he's not necessarily credited on it. His work's all running through the tracks like a stick of rock. Had been replaced by Fernando and then Henning Schmitz, and Fritz Hilpert had become an integral part of the band's sonic architecture. There is an absolutely fascinating video of the band backstage in Paris that was shot for News, which involves a guided tour of the band's studio. I'm going to link to that. That's absolutely fascinating to watch. And you get to see a flavour of what the group is without actually being on stage. The second thing is obviously we got some touring. And although it wasn't a world tour on the stage of 1981's world tour, the band played Europe. They played all over Europe, actually. They played the UK to start with, and then the rest of Europe towards the end of the year. 1992, they played the UK again. 1993, they played Germany and Austria before going into hibernation. They didn't get to America, they didn't get to Japan, they didn't get to the rest of the world, but they did do that in the coming years, which is going to be the next episode about Kraftwerk whenever I can be bothered to get around to it. In the meantime, take care of yourselves and each other, stay beautiful, and if you're going to gigs in London or Margate in the next few days, I will probably see you there. Mine will be an ice cream because it'll be quite warm. But if you're not going to those, have a lovely time anyway and enjoy the summer in whatever form it comes, because right now it appears to be lost in the post here in the UK. All right, so see you later, and take care of yourselves. I am off for a well-deserved cup of iced fizzy orange. Bye.